Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. 15 years ago, the Sydney Morning Herald reported on the permanent drought in Southeast Australia. It may be time to stop describing Southeastern Australia as gripped with drought and instead accept the extreme dry as permanent, one of the nation's most senior weather experts warned yesterday. Perhaps we should call it our new climate, said the Bureau of Meteorology's head of climate analysis, David Jones. And then in 2009, climate change bringing Australia perpetual drought. A new Australian government report says that global warming appears to be occurring faster than earlier thought likely, and the country's protracted drought is probably here to stay. Climate change is with us now, and unless we act now, it will only get worse in the life of our children. Australian Minister for Climate Change and Water Penny Wong said in response to the report. But it didn't take long for nature to demonstrate that Australian government officials had no clue what they were talking about. The following year, it rained so much in Australia that water accumulating on the ground surface actually lowered sea level. 15 years ago, climate alarmists said that Australia was in a permanent drought caused by the burning of fossil fuels. But now they've changed their story and say that the burning of fossil fuels causes too much rain. The world's #1 climate fraudster, Michael Mann, says the burning of fossil fuels is causing the climate of Australia to alternate between flood and drought. And he says they can end this pattern by eliminating the use of low-cost, reliable energy. But had he done any actual research, he would have known that alternating flood and drought is the normal climate of Australia and has been since at least 1789. This article is from the Sydney Morning Herald, January 4th, 1876. They documented the alternating drought and floods which occurred between 1789 and 1864. Australia's worst drought occurred between 1895 and 1903. Dorothy McKellar wrote the poem My Country in 1908. Core of my heart, my country, her pitiless blue sky. When sick at heart around us, we see the cattle die. But then the gray clouds gather and we can bless again the drumming of the army, the steady soaking rain. The drought during that time was the most severe on record in eastern Australia. Compare that to the last 2 years, during which time none of Australia has been in drought. The Federation drought brought the worst heat wave in Australia's history during January 1896. The New York Times described it as the hottest of hot waves on record and said the temperature got up to 127 degrees in the shade in Adelaide. That drought covered much of the globe and killed 19 million people in India and 10 million people in China. Michael Mann is a classic snake oil salesman telling people he can end an imaginary problem with an imaginary cure. It's been known for decades that Australia tends to be dry during El Niño events and tends to get very wet during La Niña, which is what's been occurring for the past 2 years. Superstitions about climate change have plagued mankind for as long as humans have been able to communicate. In 1846, it was reported that great changes have taken place in the climate of Australia, all testimonies satisfactorily prove. The Aborigines said that the climate had undergone this change since white man came in country. In 1871, the Brisbane Courier reported on imaginary changes of climate. Every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month, one of the driest or wettest or windiest, coldest or hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. In 1939, the Des Moines Register reported that the myth of climate change arises over and over again. In 1906, Harvard professor Robert Zucorsi Ward said the belief in climate change is a result of people's defective memories. And in 1963, the Chicago Tribune reported the same thing. Climate is still the same, memories are to blame. Superstitions about climate are what allow professional snake oil salesmen like Michael Mann to operate. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on climate scamsters like Michael Mann for the past 14 years. You can visit Toto, Kyrie, Caesar, Toki, and Upla on the web at realclimatescience.com.